Welcome to the adventure of the Malayan Manuscript, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Shadows of Empire. The unseen cases of Sherlock Holmes, playing in the year 1892. It is with a degree of professional duty that I present these accounts, drawn from what were once highly classified Foreign Office documents. These files, only recently brought to light, contain our correspondence and official reports pertaining to matters of grave imperial significance, forming a record of the shadows of empire, the unseen cases of Sherlock Holmes. These investigations, undertaken between 1885 and 1914, saw my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes navigate the murky waters of colonial intrigue during the zenith of British power. We confronted dilemmas stretching from London's darkest corners to the farthest reaches of the empire, often challenging the very foundations of its authority. From this collection of rather sensitive affairs, I shall now recount a most singular investigation. It concerns the curious matter I have entitled The Adventure of the Malayan Manuscript. Chapter 1. The November evening had drawn in, and a chill wind rattled the window panes of our Baker Street lodgings. A cheerful fire blazed in the hearth, its crackle a counterpoint to the distant rumble of hansoms on the cobbled street below. I was engrossed in a medical journal, whilst Holmes, opposite me, was meticulously cataloguing his notes on the Abernethy family tragedy. The quiet of our sanctuary was abruptly broken by a sharp, insistent rapping at the door, followed by the tread of Mrs. Hudson upon the stair. A moment later, she presented a stark white card upon a salver. Holmes took it, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "Mycroft," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He murmured, a note of weary resignation in his voice. "This bodes ill for our quiet evening, Watson," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He rose, casting his papers aside. "Come, the game is afoot, and it is evidently of some urgency. My brother does not employ such peremptory summons for trivialities." A cab was swiftly procured, and we rattled through foggy London streets, gas lamps casting hazy aureoles. Our destination, the Diogenes Club in Pall Mall, was an edifice I entered with trepidation. It was a place of profound, almost sepulchral silence, its principal rule being that no member should notice another. The immobile porter admitted us with a silent nod, the heavy oak door closing with a soft, decisive thud, sealing out the city's clamor. We were ushered into a private chamber, sparsely furnished, but for a large desk and several stern portraits upon the walls. There, before a meager fire, sat Mycroft Holmes. His considerable bulk seemed to fill the armchair, and though his eyes were heavy-lidded, the keen intellect within was unmistakable. He gestured towards two vacant chairs with a languid hand, the only sound the faint rustle of his starched cuffs. His voice when he spoke was low and measured, yet carried the weight of authority. "Sherlock," remarked Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft intoned, his voice low but carrying. "Dr. Watson, I trust your journey was not unduly inconvenient." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "An unfortunate matter has arisen which requires your particular talents, Sherlock," responded Mycroft Holmes. The air in the room felt heavy with unspoken concerns. Sir Alan Carmichael, a colonial administrator recently returned from Malaya, was found dead in his Bloomsbury flat this morning. He had been controversial. Clutched in his hand was a manuscript written in the Jawi script. We have had it hastily examined. Its contents, should they become public, possess the potential to gravely inflame anti-British sentiment in the Straits Settlements, remarked Mycroft Holmes. My friend leaned forward, his customary languor vanishing. "The Straits Settlements, an area of considerable strategic importance, I believe," Sherlock Holmes noted. "Precisely," answered Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft affirmed, his tone grave. "Singapore, Penang, Malacca vital trade arteries, rich in tin and rubber. Unrest that would have far-reaching consequences for the empire." The Diogenes Club and others are anxious this affair be handled with utmost discretion and expediency. We must understand the manuscript's true significance and Sir Alan's demise, responded Mycroft Holmes. I confess, as Mycroft's words sank in, a shiver ran down my spine. This was far beyond any domestic crime we had encountered. The very stability of a vital colonial territory hung in the balance. Controversial, you said, Mycroft. In what manner was Sir Alan's administration contentious? Deduced Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's query was sharp, cutting to the heart of the matter. Reports suggest a robust handling of a local uprising before his recall, with accusations of excessive force. The manuscript, we fear, might fuel narratives painting British rule harshly. We must learn if his death connects to these Malayan affairs, or if it's an unrelated tragedy that inconveniently brought this document to light. Mycroft Holmes said. Holmes rose, his eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. A delicate intersection of personal tragedy and imperial politics. The problem is not without its points of interest. Very well, Mycroft, I shall investigate. Preserving stability in such a critical region is, as you imply, of no small import, observed Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of what might have been relief passed across Mycroft's usually impassive features. He produced a slip of paper from his waistcoat pocket. Excellent, Sherlock. Here is the address of Sir Alan Carmichael's flat in Bloomsbury. Inspector Gregson has secured the scene, but has been instructed to await your arrival before proceeding further. I suggest you make it your first port of call, Mycroft Holmes said. The hansom cab deposited us before a soot-stained Bloomsbury terrace. A uniformed constable stood at the door, his breath pluming in the chill morning air. The clip-clop of a dray horse echoed from a nearby mews as we ascended the worn stone steps. Mycroft's urgent summons lent a grim anticipation to our arrival. Inspector Lestrade, looking harried, met us in the narrow hallway. The air hung heavy with stale tobacco and a faint, spicy, foreign aroma. Floorboards groaned as he led us to a room at the rear of the ground floor. His voice was gruff, as usual. Holmes, Watson, nasty business. Sir Alistair Finch, found by his charwoman this morning. Looks like he put an end to it himself. Pistol by his side, door locked from within, remarked Inspector Lestrade. Holmes merely nodded, his keen grey eyes already sweeping the threshold. Locked, you say, Lestrade. And the key, replied Sherlock Holmes. In his pocket, just as you'd expect, Lestrade replied, with an air of weary certainty. Remarked Inspector Lestrade. We entered the study, a sombre room lined with books and dominated by a large mahogany desk. Sir Alistair lay sprawled in his chair, head slumped to one side. My gaze was drawn to the object clutched in his right hand, a roll of dark, unfamiliar parchment, tied with a silken cord. The Malayan manuscript Mycroft had mentioned, I presumed. Holmes, however, paid the manuscript little initial heed. He moved with swift, silent grace, his attention darting from carpet to window fastenings, then to the cold ashes in the fireplace. A low hum from the gas lamp, and the distant, mournful cry of a newsboy were the only sounds. He stooped suddenly, examining the rug near the desk. Interesting, he murmured, his voice quiet but distinct. The nap of the carpet here is disturbed, yet there are no corresponding scuff marks on Sir Alistair's boots, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He then turned his attention to the deceased. With a delicate touch, he examined the hand gripping the manuscript. Tightly held, Lestrade very tightly, almost unnaturally so for a man in the throes of self-destruction. Lestrade grumbled. Desperate men do desperate things, Holmes, answered Inspector Lestrade. Holmes straightened, his gaze finally settling on the desk itself. Amongst the neat array of pens and papers, one item seemed to draw his particular focus. It was a slightly creased sheet of official-looking foolscap, positioned near where the dead man's left hand might have rested. He leaned closer, his hawk-like nose almost touching the paper. Ah, he breathed, satisfaction evident. Watson, your eyes are younger than mine. Do you perceive a faint impression upon this document, here beside the ink blotter? Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. I peered where he indicated. At first, I saw nothing but the texture of the paper. Then, as I shifted my angle to catch the weak light from the window, I discerned a very faint, almost invisible circular mark. There were some barely perceptible indentations within it. "By Jove, Holmes!" I exclaimed softly. "It looks like the impression of a ring, a signet ring, perhaps," Dr. John Watson commented. His eyes gleamed. "Precisely, Watson, and not just any signet. Observe the character of the indentations, faint as they are. There's a certain boldness, a suggestion of heraldic design, yes, but with a distinct martial character. It speaks of lineage, certainly, but more pointedly of military service, perhaps in the colonies. The style is reminiscent of crests I have encountered among officers who have served in the East. The kind of ring a man like Colonel Fawcett, for example, might wear. A man known to have had recent, and perhaps strained, dealings with Sir Alistair. We must discover whose finger, bearing such a distinctive mark of authority and colonial service, pressed it here with such force. Mark my words, this faint impression may prove to be the very linchpin of this entire affair. Connecting this tragedy to specific individuals within those circles of influence we have yet to fully penetrate, declared Sherlock Holmes. He glanced again at the body, then at the manuscript. The clatter of a milk cart starting its rounds drifted in from the street, a mundane sound starkly contrasting with the grim tableau before us. "A locked room, Lestrade," Holmes continued, his voice taking on a didactic edge. "A convenient pistol, and a man clutching a document of potentially immense political significance. Yet we have disturbed carpet with no corresponding marks, a grip of iron on this manuscript, and now the ghost of a rather particular signet ring. It paints a picture, does it not, that is rather more complex than simple despair," explained Sherlock Holmes. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Holmes carefully prized the Jawi manuscript from Sir Alistair's grasp. "This," he said, holding up the roll, his voice now brisk and businesslike, "requires closer examination in a more suitable environment. The answers, I suspect, lie as much within these ancient markings as they do within the confines of this room. Come, Watson. Our work here is done for the moment, but the true investigation is only just beginning," explained Sherlock Holmes. With a final, sweeping glance around the dead administrator's flat, Holmes turned, the mysterious manuscript in hand. The puzzle of Sir Alistair Finch's death, and the silent testimony of the signet ring's imprint promised a labyrinthine path ahead. It was a path I knew Holmes would tread with eager anticipation. The dim London afternoon cast long shadows into our Baker Street rooms. Below, the usual rumble of hansoms on the cobbles was a muted counterpoint to the intense quiet within. For hours, Holmes had been hunched over the peculiar Jawi manuscript. His brow was furrowed in concentration. A lens occasionally glinted in his hand as he scrutinized the unfamiliar script. The only sounds were the rustle of the brittle pages and the occasional sharp intake of his breath. A log shifted in the grate, sending a brief shower of sparks upwards. Holmes, however, remained oblivious, lost in the labyrinth of Eastern characters. "Watson!" he exclaimed suddenly, his voice sharp with rarely betrayed excitement, startling me from my perusal of the Strand magazine. "This document is our primary clue from the unfortunate administrator's effects. It is not what it purports to be," Sherlock Holmes responded. He straightened then. His eyes gleamed with that familiar fire I knew so well, the fire that burned brightest when the game was afoot. He paced before the hearth, the manuscript held delicately in one hand. His energy seemed to electrify the very air of the room. "Consider the language, my dear fellow. Here," explained Sherlock Holmes. He tapped a specific passage with a long finger. This phrase describes a supposed ambush. Serangan Hendap, it reads. It is a perfectly acceptable modern Malay term. I grant you that. However, it is utterly out of place in a document claiming to be from a century past. The classical Jawi of that period would employ a more archaic, a more formal construction altogether, declared Sherlock Holmes. I leaned closer, though the script was meaningless to me. His conviction, however, was palpable. The scent of old paper and the faint, exotic aroma of the ink filled my nostrils. And the very fabric of the thing, he continued, his voice rising with enthusiasm. Observe the edges of this parchment. Yes, they are frayed, but their uniformity speaks of artificial distress, not the natural wear of decades. The ink, too, despite its careful fading, it lacks true depth. It lacks the subtle chemical changes that only time itself can impart. It is a remarkably skillful imitation, Watson, designed to deceive, but an imitation it is, nonetheless. Sherlock Holmes noted. An imitation, the word hung in the air. The entire foundation of our theories about the administrator's demise seemed to crumble. This is no ancient chronicle of Malayan grievances, declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes declared, his tone now firm and accusatory. It is a contemporary fabrication, Watson, a meticulously crafted narrative. It is intended to detail supposed atrocities, meant to provide a pretext, a motive, for what the world would perceive as a justified act of native revenge upon a colonial official. The hand of Colonel Fawcett, or at least those who share his aggressive colonial ambitions, is clearly upon this forgery. Colonel Fawcett, the name resonated with the undercurrents of colonial rivalry we had begun to sense. The audacity of such a deception was breathtaking. And do you recall, Watson, that faint imprint we discovered on a blotter in the deceased study? The almost imperceptible signet ring impression, declared Sherlock Holmes. He paused, allowing the question to settle. The crest had a military bearing. It was complex and authoritative. This manuscript, this elaborate lie, would require a seal of approval, a stamp of authenticity. Perhaps it was even commissioned by an individual wielding such authority, an individual precisely like Colonel Fawcett, deduced Sherlock Holmes. The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity. The signet ring, once a tantalizing but isolated clue, now formed a crucial link in Holmes's chain of evidence. His deductions had again cut through uncertainty's fog. For a moment, only the faint scratch of his pen broke the silence. Fawcett's faction, then, seeks to destabilize, to justify harsher measures in Malaya, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes mused, more to himself than to me, his gaze distant. But to what precise end? We need a broader understanding of the political currents, and of the true stakes in this game of empire. The whispers within the Diogenes Club spoke of strategic importance and of unrest. He turned to me then, a new line of inquiry already forming in his mind. Watson, observed Sherlock Holmes. He said, his voice brisk once more, I believe a visit is in order. I know someone who moves in circles that could illuminate these colonial machinations. Lady Beatrice Foxglove. She possesses a keen understanding of the societal chessboard. Her insights into the rubber plantation interests and the political climate surrounding Malaya could prove invaluable. I nodded, ready as ever to follow where his intellect led. The mystery of the Malayan manuscript had deepened. It drew us further into a web of imperial intrigue. I sensed that our conversation with Lady Foxglove would soon shed more light upon this dangerous path. The fire crackled, a comforting sound against the growing chill of the evening, as we prepared for our next step. The following afternoon, after Holmes had dispatched a flurry of telegrams, their contents, as usual, a mystery to me, we found ourselves ascending the polished stone steps of Lady Beatrice Foxglove's Mayfair residence. The air here was noticeably quieter than on Baker Street. The rumble of distant carriages provided a muted counterpoint to the discreet clip-clop of well-shod horses on the cobbled mews, a liveried footman, whose bearing spoke of years of impeccable service, admitted us into a hall where the hushed, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock seemed to measure out the very essence of refined society. Lady Beatrice received us in her drawing-room, a chamber replete with tasteful chinoiserie and the delicate, pervasive scent of hothouse flowers. Sunlight, filtered through lace curtains, cast soft patterns on the Persian rug. She was, as ever, a figure of composed elegance, her greeting warm yet possessed of an underlying shrewdness that I had long come to respect. Her voice, melodious but firm, cut gently through the room's quietude as she addressed Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, it is always a pleasure, though I suspect your visits are rarely for purely social reasons." "Tea, gentlemen," remarked Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Holmes, declining the offer with a slight wave of his hand, the rustle of his sleeve barely audible, came directly to the point, his tone brisk. "Your ladyship's acuity is, as always, precise. We are embroiled in the unfortunate matter of Sir Alistair Finch's demise, and more particularly, the curious manuscript found with him. Its implications, we believe, stretch to Malaya," explained Sherlock Holmes. Lady Beatrice settled into a silk-upholstered chair with a soft rustle. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to pause as her gaze sharpened, filling the room with a palpable tension. "Ah, Malaya, a tinderbox, Mr. Holmes," said Lady Beatrice Foxglove. She paused, her fingers lightly tracing the arm of her chair, the silence punctuated only by the distant, muffled clang of a tradesman's bell from the street below. "The recent uprising, though suppressed, has left deep fissures. Sir Alistair was not universally beloved, neither here nor there. His methods were direct," responded Lady Beatrice Foxglove. "So we have gathered," I interjected. "But this manuscript, Lady Beatrice, it appears to be a fabrication designed to inflame tensions further," asked Dr. John Watson. Holmes shot me a quick glance, then turned back to our hostess. "Indeed, a most cunningly wrought deception, intended, it would seem, to portray native grievances in the starkest, most brutal light," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He fixed Lady Beatrice with an intense gaze, the afternoon sun catching the sharp planes of his face. "The question is, who benefits from such a dangerous charade, particularly one implicating a man like Finch posthumously?" Sherlock Holmes noted. Lady Foxglove tapped a thoughtful finger against her lips. The distant, delicate clink of porcelain from another room, perhaps a maid preparing the tea tray despite our refusal, was the only sound for a moment. Lady Beatrice mused, her gaze distant for a moment, as if surveying the vast plantations themselves before she spoke. "Benefits," said Lady Beatrice Foxglove. A faint smile touched her lips, though her eyes remained serious. A carriage rumbled past on the street outside, its sound a brief intrusion. "Consider the rubber, Mr. Holmes. The plantations are the lifeblood of our colonial venture there. Fortunes are being made and lost," Lady Beatrice Foxglove answered. Her voice dropped slightly, drawing us in. "Any instability, real or manufactured, can shift power, influence policy," remarked Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers steepled, absorbing the complex interplay of commerce and colonial power she described. The only sound from him was the faint tap of a finger against its opposite. I, too, listened intently, the scale of the interests involved becoming clearer. Lady Beatrice continued, her voice lowering slightly, a subtle emphasis on the name as she leaned forward conspiratorially, the scent of her perfume momentarily more pronounced. "And some, like Colonel Fawcett, advocate for a much firmer hand, believing leniency invites rebellion," Lady Beatrice Foxglove replied. The name, when spoken, seemed to carry a chill into the warm room. "Such a document, if believed, would bolster their arguments immensely," replied Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes alight with that familiar keenness, the very air around him seeming to crackle with sudden energy. He mused, his eyes narrowing. Fawcett, a name that keeps surfacing. The signet ring bore his crest, a detail of mounting importance. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. I watched as Holmes rose, the sudden movement causing a slight creak from his chair. He paced a short step, the energy radiating from him almost palpable, his shoes making soft thuds on the thick carpet. The pieces were indeed falling into place with an alarming clarity he was now articulating. He stopped his pacing and turned back to Lady Beatrice, his tone hardening with conviction. If his aim was to discredit Finch, or worse, justify harsher colonial measures, this fabricated manuscript would suit perfectly. He paused, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window, as if visualizing the colonel's machinations. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour, its mellow tones a counterpoint to Holmes's sharp deductions. He'd emerge as the iron fist needed to quell unrest, declared Sherlock Holmes. The pieces were beginning to form a more coherent, if disturbing, picture in my own mind. The political machinations Lady Beatrice described painted a landscape far more treacherous than I had initially imagined. Lady Beatrice's voice, when she spoke again, held a distinct note of caution, and she picked up a small ivory letter opener from the nearby table, turning it over in her fingers. Colonel Fawcett is ambitious, and I fear possesses fewer scruples than one might wish for in a man of his position. Lady Beatrice Foxglove replied. She sighed softly, the sound barely audible, and placed the letter opener back on the polished wood with a faint click. The stakes in the Straits Settlements are extraordinarily high. The entire region is a chessboard, and every piece moved has repercussions, said Lady Beatrice Foxglove. Holmes, who had listened intently, his chin resting on his hand, now rose from his chair with a decisive movement, his expression thoughtful. Your insights have been invaluable, Lady Beatrice. You have illuminated the political currents beneath this affair, replied Sherlock Holmes. He offered a slight bow, a gesture of respect. The room seemed to hold its breath, awaiting his next pronouncement. It seems the heart of this mystery lies not only in a man's death, but in the very fabric of colonial ambition and its attendant rivalries, explained Sherlock Holmes. He paused again, then his focus sharpened as he moved towards the next logical step in his investigation. There is a Miss Evelyn Hayes, an anthropologist who corresponded with Sir Alistair. Her perspective on Malayan culture might provide the next thread. Sherlock Holmes noted. Lady Beatrice nodded slowly. Miss Hayes, yes. A rather idealistic young woman, I believe. She may offer a view untainted by political expediency, replied Lady Beatrice Foxglove. As we took our leave, the heavy oak door closing behind us with a soft thud, the weight of empires and the intrigues they fostered seemed to hang heavy in the Mayfair air, a stark contrast to the quiet, sun-dappled elegance of Lady Foxglove's drawing-room. Following our unsettling interview with Lady Foxglove, Holmes, with that familiar spark of determination in his eye, announced our next destination. Miss Evelyn Hayes. This was the young anthropologist whose correspondence with Sir Alistair Finch had so intrigued him. Thus, the subsequent afternoon saw me, as was often my lot, navigating the hallowed precincts of University College in Holmes's wake. The ancient quadrangle seemed to breathe history. The very flagstones beneath our boots, worn smooth by generations of scholars, echoed with whispers of intellectual endeavor. A distinct aroma of old books and beeswax hung in the cool air, punctuated by the distant, rhythmic cadence of a lecturer's voice, and now and then the fleeting melody of a student's piano practice drifting from an open casement window. Our own footfalls rang out, with a sharp clarity in the otherwise studious quiet. Miss Hayes's office, when we found it, was situated high in a more modern annex, its clean lines a surprising counterpoint to the weathered grandeur of the older college buildings. Though modest in size, the room was a veritable cabinet of curiosities, a miniature museum dedicated to distant cultures. Bookshelves overflowed with imposing volumes on anthropology and far-flung societies, their spines a tapestry of titles. One entire wall was dominated by large-scale maps of the Malay archipelago, dotted with precise annotations. Her desk and the surrounding shelves were adorned with an array of intricate carvings and brightly colored beadwork, each piece, I surmised, holding a personal significance. The predominant sound upon our entry was the sonorous, metronomic ticking of a grandfather clock, somewhere in the hushed corridor beyond. This, mingled with the faint, undulating drone of a lecture from a deeper part of the building, created an atmosphere of profound academic calm within her small domain. Miss Evelyn Hayes stood to welcome us as we stepped inside. I estimated her age to be no more than 25. Her eyes, strikingly clear and intelligent, met ours with a directness that bespoke a keen mind, while her overall demeanor conveyed a quiet, scholarly conviction. Her handshake was surprisingly firm, her manner forthright, though a touch of academic reserve tempered her greeting. When she spoke, her voice was as steady and clear as her gaze, possessing a pleasing, almost lyrical quality. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, please do come in. I received your card. How may I be of assistance?" remarked Miss Evelyn Hayes. Holmes inclined his head politely. His keen eyes, as I had come to expect, were already making a comprehensive sweep of the room, absorbing and cataloguing every minute detail with their usual astonishing rapidity. "Miss Hayes, we are investigating the circumstances surrounding the unfortunate demise of Sir Alistair Finch. We understand you were in correspondence with him," observed Sherlock Holmes. I observed a flicker of sorrow, brief but unmistakable, cross Miss Hayes's expressive features. When she replied, her voice was tinged with a genuine and profound sadness. "Indeed, I was. His death came as a terrible shock. Sir Alistair, you see, was a most dedicated student of Malayan culture, with a particular fascination for its folklore. Our correspondence revolved chiefly around these topics. He had a remarkable mind, though his curiosity could, at times, be rather unconventional," replied Miss Evelyn Hayes. "Unconventional, you say? In what manner?" replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes leaned forward a fraction, his interest visibly sharpening. I recognized that familiar, intense glint in his eyes, the look he wore when a scent was caught. He seemed less interested in the purely academic classifications, the dry cataloging of facts, "you understand," replied Miss Evelyn Hayes. She paused, her brow furrowing slightly as she sought the precise words, her gaze drifting towards the maps on her wall, as if seeking inspiration there. It was more the spirit of the tales that captivated him, the underlying beliefs, the cultural currents that shaped their very essence. He frequently inquired about narratives concerning power, hidden knowledge, and particularly the moral responsibilities of those who wield such influence, said Miss Evelyn Hayes. I saw Holmes nod slowly, his gaze fixed with an almost magnetic intensity upon a particular manuscript lying open on her crowded desk. A Jawi primer, I deduced from the elegant, unfamiliar script. For a long moment, the only sound disturbing the room's stillness, aside from the relentless ticking of the corridor clock, was the faint, almost imperceptible scrape of Holmes shifting his weight in his chair, a tiny noise that seemed to resonate in the profound quiet. "And did any specific legends feature prominently in your discussions, Miss Hayes? Perhaps something pertaining to ancient writings or symbols of authority?" Sherlock Holmes noted. Miss Hayes tilted her head, her expression thoughtful as she carefully considered Holmes's pointed question. "There was one recurring theme Sir Alistair found particularly captivating, tales of what are known locally as Hikyat Kedalan," responded Miss Evelyn Hayes. She pronounced the Malay words with a quiet fluency that spoke volumes of her deep immersion in the subject, her gaze distant as if picturing the very chronicles themselves. "The Chronicle of Justice, one might translate it. It's not a single, definitive text, Mr. Holmes, more an evolving tapestry of oral traditions and fragmented ancient writings passed down through generations. Miss Evelyn Hayes said. She made a slight, encompassing gesture with her hand, as if attempting to convey the very elusiveness of the concept. The steady, rhythmic beat of the corridor clock seemed to mark time with her contemplative silence. These traditions speak of a righteous ruler from antiquity whose wisdom was enshrined in certain symbols, Miss Evelyn Hayes said. Holmes listened with rapt attention, his gaze unwavering and fixed upon her. The only other sound in that quiet room was the soft, dry rustle of a page turning as Miss Hayes idly shifted a nearby book on her paper-strewn desk. And crucially, these traditions warn how misinterpreting or misusing these potent symbols could bring not just personal ruin, but devastation to the land and its people, replied Miss Evelyn Hayes. Her voice lowered slightly as she spoke, taking on a more serious, almost solemn timbre that underscored the gravity of the legends. Sir Alistair was particularly intrigued, I might even say preoccupied, with how such a chronicle, such a powerful concept, might be reactivated, as he termed it, within the challenging realities of the modern colonial world. Miss Evelyn Hayes said. Holmes straightened in his chair, and I saw that unmistakable, intense gleam, the hunter's spark, illuminate his eyes. His attention then shifted, and he gestured with a slender finger towards a small, intricately carved wooden box resting on a nearby side table. Its dark, polished wood was a striking contrast to the surrounding clutter of academic papers. A beautiful piece, Miss Hayes. From the Malay Peninsula, I presume, explained Sherlock Holmes. He picked up the box with a delicate touch, his long fingers tracing the elaborate carvings with evident appreciation. Even from my position, I could discern the coolness of the aged wood, and more faintly, an almost imperceptible, yet distinctly exotic, aroma of spices clinging to it. The carving style is quite distinct Kenya, I should venture, or perhaps from a related Dayak group. Yet, there's an unusual motif here, almost Javanese in its intricate detail. Sir Alistair sent this to you, did he not? Miss Hayes appeared genuinely taken aback, her eyes widening in undisguised surprise. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was laced with an astonishment she made no attempt to conceal. Why, yes. How could you possibly deduce that, Mr. Holmes? It arrived only last month, replied Miss Evelyn Hayes. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Holmes's lips. His tone, when he replied, was that of a patient instructor gently guiding an attentive student through an elementary deduction. The packing material, Miss Hayes, provides the initial clue. Observe these few-minute strands still caught within the hinge of the lid. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He delicately indicated the almost invisible fibers with the tip of his finger. I leaned closer, though I confess I would have overlooked them entirely. That, you see, is rice straw. It is of a type commonly employed in the Straits Settlements for the packaging of goods intended for export, quite distinct, you will note, from the coarser English straw used domestically, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He paused then, allowing Miss Hayes a moment to absorb this initial point, a distinct twinkle of amusement in his keen eyes. From somewhere beyond the window, the mellow chime of a college bell floated in, marking the quarter hour, a brief, melodic intrusion into the room's scholarly hush. Furthermore, Holmes continued, his voice smooth and even, were you to examine the wood itself with a discerning nostril, you would detect the subtle, lingering aroma of cloves, and perhaps a trace of sandalwood, still clinging to its surface. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Miss Hayes leaned forward, her expression a fascinating blend of renewed surprise and keen academic interest. I confess, I too found myself subtly inhaling, attempting, rather unsuccessfully, to catch the exotic fragrances Holmes so effortlessly identified. These particular spices, Miss Hayes, are frequently employed as desiccants and fragrant protectors for delicate artifacts originating from that specific region of the globe. Given your established correspondence with Sir Alistair on Malayan matters, the connection, if I may permit myself the observation, was indeed elementary. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. I must confess, even with my somewhat trained eye for Holmes's methods, these subtle indicators had entirely escaped my notice. Miss Hayes, however, was clearly impressed, her scholarly mind visibly appreciating the elegance of his logical progression. Remarkable. He said it was a token of appreciation for my insights into the local narratives. He felt they offered a different perspective on the troubles there, answered Miss Evelyn Hayes. Indeed, a different perspective is precisely what we are seeking. Your insights have been most valuable, Miss Hayes. You have painted a picture of a man grappling with more than just administrative duties, observed Sherlock Holmes. His voice softened then, taking on a more contemplative tone, his gaze becoming distant, as if peering into the complexities of Sir Alistair's mind. A man, perhaps, seeking answers in ancient lore that his official position could not provide, stated Sherlock Holmes. We took our leave shortly thereafter, expressing our gratitude to Miss Hayes. As we stepped from the tranquil sanctuary of her study, the insistent ticking of the corridor clock gradually receded. Emerging once more into the bustling London afternoon, the unique scholarly atmosphere of the university, that blend of distant voices, the whisper of turning pages, and the pervasive scent of aged books began to dissipate. It was soon replaced by the crisper air of the city streets and the steadily increasing rumble of urban traffic as we approached the main thoroughfare. I had the distinct impression that our conversation with the earnest young anthropologist had yielded something of profound significance to our inquiry. An idealistic young woman, Watson, yet her information is vital. Sir Alistair was clearly treading a dangerous path between colonial policy and local belief. It seems the manuscript he clutched was more than mere paper and ink to him, observed Sherlock Holmes. So, you believe this folklore she spoke of is directly linked to the manuscript Sir Alistair clutched in death? I inquired, attempting to connect the disparate threads of this increasingly complex affair. Dr. John Watson replied. He gave a curt nod, his expression resolute, his sharp mind, I could tell, already several steps ahead, charting the course of our investigation. Indubitably, Watson. And now we must ascertain how these different perspectives align, or indeed clash, with the official narrative, Sherlock Holmes said. As we reached the curb, Holmes hailed a passing hansom with a sharp, decisive gesture. The sudden clatter of hooves on cobblestone and the rumble of iron-shod wheels were momentarily deafening before the cabby expertly drew his vehicle to a halt beside us. My companion's focus, I observed, was already arrowing towards our next port of call. Our next visit must be to the colonial office. I suspect we shall find a rather more pragmatic and perhaps considerably less sympathetic view of Malayan chronicles within those hallowed halls, remarked Sherlock Holmes. Miss Hayes's insights into Malayan folklore and its link to the Jawi manuscript had clearly set Holmes on a new path. The next morning, a thick London fog swirled outside our Baker Street windows, mirroring the case's obscurities. The clatter of milk pails below was a mundane counterpoint to our exotic puzzle. As I read the morning paper, Holmes's sharp, decisive voice cut in. Watson, our inquiries today must take us to the very heart of the imperial machine. We shall visit the colonial office. The death of Mr. Pembrose, and indeed this manuscript, cannot be divorced from his official duties, replied Sherlock Holmes. A hansom cab took us through grey, echoing streets to Whitehall. The colonial office stood before us, grand and imposing. Inside, cool air carried the faint, dry scent of old paper and sealing wax. A hushed efficiency filled the halls. Clerks moved quietly, their footsteps soft on polished stone floors, and the scratch of pens was a constant, low hum. After a brief exchange with a junior secretary, his clipped tones reflecting his station, we were shown into a waiting area. The rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corridor was the loudest sound, marking the minutes with a steady beat. Soon a door opened. A tall man of military bearing and rigid posture entered. His mustache was impeccably groomed, his eyes a pale, assessing blue. The junior secretary announced deferentially, "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to see Colonel Fawcett." Colonial office staff replied. His voice, firm with a parade ground resonance, filled the quiet office. "Holmes, is it? What brings you to meddle in colonial affairs?" Pembrose's death was regrettable, but hardly a matter for unofficial investigation, replied Colonel Reginald Fawcett. His gaze was direct, yet I detected a flicker of unease beneath his composure. Holmes met his stare evenly. "Colonel Fawcett, I meddle where mystery calls. Mr. Pembrose died clutching a rather singular manuscript. Its nature, I believe, directly concerns your department's interests in the Straits Settlements," observed Sherlock Holmes. The colonel waved a dismissive hand, the gesture a little too broad. "A trifle, Holmes. Some local superstition, no doubt. Pembrose had a peculiar interest in such things. Frankly, his methods in Malaya were unorthodox, caused more trouble than they were worth," said Colonel Reginald Fawcett. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. I noticed a faint, reddish-brown stain on the colonel's otherwise immaculate white shirt cuff, a detail Fawcett himself seemed to miss. Holmes spoke with a quiet intensity, making the colonel shift uncomfortably. "Unorthodox, perhaps, yet effective enough to quell an uprising, I understand. And this manuscript, Colonel, you seem remarkably certain of its insignificance. Have you, by chance, examined it yourself?" Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Fawcett's reply was a shade too quick, his tone hardening. "I am a busy man, Mr. Holmes. I rely on reports. The official view is that Pembrose took his own life, tormented by his actions. The manuscript is irrelevant," responded Colonel Reginald Fawcett. Holmes rose, and I followed. The interview seemed over, yet I knew my friend had gleaned more than the colonel intended. As we walked back into the echoing corridor, the scent of floor polish and old ledgers heavy in the air, Holmes was briefly silent. Holmes murmured, his voice low, "Observe, Watson. The good colonel protests too much, and with an ill-concealed agitation. That stain on his cuff, not ink nor wine. It is laterite, Watson, the characteristic red soil of Malaya. Curious for a man who claims to rely solely on reports from afar," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. "Good heavens, Holmes, you mean he has been there recently, or handled something directly from there?" Dr. John Watson said. Holmes's lips curved into a grim smile. "Precisely, and his eagerness to dismiss the manuscript, coupled with his animosity towards Pembrose. A pattern begins to emerge, Watson. A pattern of suppression and, I suspect, direct involvement. Our next conversation must be with someone who understands the Malay perspective more intimately. We shall call upon Raja Iskandar," observed Sherlock Holmes. The prospect of meeting the Malay noble, whose allegiances were uncertain, added further intrigue to the case's deepening shadows. The game, as Holmes would say, was most decidedly afoot. The Diogenes Club, Mycroft's somber retreat, offered a private room paneled in dark wood, its profound quietude broken only by the distant, rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall and the muffled rumble of carriages on Pall Mall. Holmes, pacing the plush carpet, was still dissecting our encounter with Colonel Fawcett, whose veiled hostility was a fresh irritant. "Fawcett's dismissal of the manuscript speaks volumes, Watson," he murmured. "His words conceal far more than they reveal," Sherlock Holmes responded. A discreet tap at the heavy oak door, followed by its soft opening, announced Raja Iskandar. He entered with fluid dignity, his European attire impeccable, yet his dark, intelligent eyes spoke of another world. A faint, distinct scent of cloves seemed to accompany him, subtly perfuming the still air of the room. "Raja Iskandar and Anna, pray be seated. We value your time," observed Sherlock Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." His English was precise, with a musical lilt. "I am prepared to assist in any way regarding Mr. Armitage's death," Raja Iskandar answered. The Raja inclined his head, the leather of his armchair creaking softly as he settled. As Holmes began to speak of Malaya, guiding the conversation with subtle skill, I saw a flicker in the Raja's eyes, a subtle tightening of his lips that betrayed an inner tension beneath his outwardly calm and composed demeanor. "Mr. Armitage's administration in Malaya, Raja, caused friction, I understand, particularly concerning the recent uprising," replied Sherlock Holmes. "Colonial rule is seldom smooth, Mr. Holmes," the Raja replied, his tone measured. "Armitage had strong convictions. That manuscript he held, it embodies our history, our identity. Potent symbols, especially when a people feel their voice is unheard." His gaze met Holmes's directly, a silent challenge, said Raja Iskandar. "Unheard, or silenced perhaps in pursuit of imperial stability." Holmes's question was soft, yet it seemed to cut through the quiet air of the club room. Sherlock Holmes said, "Stability often serves its architects, Mr. Holmes. The yearning for self-determination is a powerful tide in any land." Raja Iskandar said. Holmes leaned forward slightly, the old wood of his own chair groaning faintly under the movement, his fingers steepled. The faint aroma of his shag tobacco, a familiar comfort, seemed almost an intrusion in this refined setting, yet it underscored his intense focus. "You speak with diplomatic skill, Raja, yet your words burn with a patriot's fire. This manuscript, is it not more than a symbol, a beacon, perhaps, for aspirations?" declared Sherlock Holmes. A slow, knowing smile touched the Raja's lips, though not his thoughtful eyes. "Mr. Holmes, your insight is renowned. Words indeed hold power. My people remember their heritage. They aspire to shape their own destiny. To deny this would be untruthful," Raja Iskandar answered. The Raja's words, though elegantly veiled, rang clear in their implication. With a few more carefully chosen pleasantries, he took his leave. As the door closed behind him, the lingering scent of cloves hung in the air, a final whisper of his presence. "A patriot, Watson, treading a perilous path," Holmes mused, as the Raja's departing footsteps faded down the carpeted corridor. "He seeks Malayan independence, undoubtedly, but with caution. The manuscript is vital, yet his words, however suggestive, are not enough. We need tangible proof, something to connect these simmering currents to men like Colonel Fawcett," replied Sherlock Holmes. "So, what is our next step, Holmes?" I asked, already anticipating the familiar gleam of pursuit in his eye. Dr. John Watson replied. "To the Colonial Office Archives, Watson," he declared, his voice suddenly energized, all languor gone. "Fawcett's Malayan service records await. They will, I fancy, illuminate much that is obscure," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Raja Iskandar's interview left me with a sense of veiled intentions, but Holmes, as ever, had distilled a clear course of action. The clatter of hooves on the embankment the next morning seemed to echo his decisiveness as we departed. His voice was crisp, cutting through the morning chill. "The Colonial Office Archives, Watson. It is there we shall find the true ledger of Malayan affairs, and perhaps the shadow of Colonel Fawcett," Sherlock Holmes responded. We entered the Colonial Office Archives, a vast, hushed labyrinth. The air hung thick with the scent of aging documents and binding glue, the silence broken only by the rustle of paper. A thin, bespectacled archivist, Mr. Featherstonehaugh, greeted us, his voice as dry as the folios he curated. He seemed mildly bewildered when Holmes specified his interest in correspondence from the Straits Settlements concerning Colonel Reginald Fawcett. He adjusted his spectacles, his tone hesitant. "Colonel Fawcett, sir. An extensive search, I should imagine. His service was varied," said Mr. Featherstonehaugh. Precisely, Mr. Featherstone. Holmes returned, a keen light in his eyes. And it is that very variety we must now meticulously chart, observed Sherlock Holmes. What followed was a remarkable display of Holmes's methods. This was no leisurely perusal. He moved amongst the towering shelves with a focused, almost predatory energy. His fingers flew through pages, eyes scanning documents with incredible speed. The constant rustle of paper was punctuated by the thud of a discarded file or the slap of a ledger opening. I heard the faint scratch of his pen, making swift notes. Hours passed, marked by shifting sunlight through grimy windows and the occasional distant cough. The sheer volume of material was daunting, yet Holmes's concentration remained absolute, like a navigator charting a course through a sea of officialdom. Suddenly he made a low sound, a hum of dawning realization. "Ah!" Holmes exclaimed softly. "The consignment records for 48, most interesting. Discrepancies in the manifests from Penang." Sherlock Holmes responded. My wandering attention snapped back. Holmes had paused before a thick, leather-bound volume, his expression one of intense scrutiny. He carefully extracted a single, creased dispatch. An absolute stillness fell upon him, a stark contrast to his earlier motion. Then a faint smile touched his lips. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but charged with an unmistakable triumph. "Observe, Watson. Observe closely," observed Sherlock Holmes. He held the document out to me. It was an official communication, penned in a bold, decisive hand. But it was not the script that drew my eye, nor even the content regarding troop movements. At the very foot of the page, pressed firmly into the paper beside the signature, was the clear and distinct impression of a signet ring, a rampant griffin, its wings unfurled. "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed, my voice hushed with the import of the discovery. "Fawcett's own seal?" Dr. John Watson inquired. He nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Indeed, a most definitive link, Watson, and one, I suspect, that will unravel more than just the Colonel's past activities. It may well illuminate the true nature of that curious Jawi manuscript," stated Sherlock Holmes. With this crucial piece of evidence secured, a tangible link to Fawcett amidst the impersonal records of empire, Holmes seemed satisfied. The echoing silence of the archives as we departed felt charged with unspoken revelations, and I knew that back in the familiar confines of Baker Street, a complex tapestry was about to be decisively unraveled. The embers in our Baker Street hearth glowed with a fierce intensity, casting dancing shadows on the book-lined walls and mirroring the triumphant gleam in Sherlock Holmes's eyes. A faint, familiar aroma of his strong tobacco hung in the air, mingling with the scent of old paper. He had returned from the Colonial Office archives not an hour since, the dust of officialdom still faintly upon his coat, yet his energy was undiminished. Before him, spread upon the table beneath the yellow glare of the gas lamp, lay the controversial Jawi manuscript, alongside several photographic plates and a sheaf of notes. The usual cacophony of London, the distant clip-clop of a hansom, the mournful cry of a newsboy seemed to fade, held at bay by the gravity of the moment. "The game, Watson, has revealed its most cunning player. This manuscript, which has caused such consternation at the Diogenes Club and threatened to ignite a diplomatic firestorm, is an impostor," Sherlock Holmes said. I leaned forward, my gaze fixed upon the elegant, yet somehow sinister, script. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the soft rustle of paper as Holmes selected a particular document from his collection of evidence. "An impostor, Holmes, but the experts, the script itself," Dr. John Watson added. "The script is clever, Watson, a masterful imitation, yet it is precisely that, an imitation. Observe the paper. It claims to be as old as ancient Malayan law, but under magnification, the fibers tell a different tale. They reveal a wood pulp content unknown in that region before the mid-19th century. A small detail, perhaps, but most telling, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He gestured towards one of the photographic plates, showing a greatly enlarged section of the manuscript. Furthermore, consider the ink. It bleeds in a manner characteristic of certain aniline dyes developed in Germany not 30 years ago. No ancient scribe, however skilled, could have employed such a medium. Then there are the anachronisms within the text itself. We find subtle references, for instance, to trade routes and political alliances. These simply did not exist until decades after the manuscript's supposed creation. The forger was skilled, Watson, but not infallible, Sherlock Holmes said. My mind reeled at the meticulous deconstruction. The manuscript, which had seemed a tangible link to a mysterious past, was dissolving into a modern deceit. But to what end, Holmes? And by whom? Asked Dr. John Watson. The whom, my dear Watson, is becoming abundantly clear. This distinctive tiger, the personal seal of Colonel Reginald Fawcett, is the key. Indeed, the very same rare pigments used to illuminate sections of this forgery also feature in colonial office records. These records, bearing Fawcett's precise seal, show the pigments were requisitioned by an agent known to be in his employ. Ostensibly, this was for cartographical embellishments. And crucially, Watson, this happened mere months before our unfortunate administrator's demise, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. As the pieces fell into place with dreadful certainty, the familiar sounds of Baker Street rushed back in. The ordinary world stood in stark contrast to the extraordinary deceit Holmes was uncovering. Colonel Fawcett, or a faction operating under his direction, is undoubtedly the architect of this elaborate deception. The manuscript was engineered, Watson, with a singular, nefarious purpose. It was designed to fabricate a history of atrocities supposedly committed by the deceased administrator. The aim, to paint him as a monster deserving of native retribution, deduced Sherlock Holmes. His voice dropped, taking on a graver tone, as he elucidated the full, chilling scope of the plot. Thus, a convenient and politically charged motive for murder is supplied: native revenge. This neatly diverts all suspicion from the true culprit. You see, Watson, the manuscript is not a relic of the past. It is a weapon of the present, designed to obscure one crime by inventing another. It stands as a testament to the depths to which men will sink to protect their interests and advance their ambitions within the complex machinery of empire, deduced Sherlock Holmes. I stared at him, the implications of his words settling heavily upon me. The quiet hiss of the gas jet seemed to underscore the silence that followed. Then Fawcett. He is not merely a forger, but the murderer of the administrator, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. John Watson added, the evidence, Watson, points inexorably towards that conclusion. A man who would go to such lengths to fabricate a past is certainly capable of shaping the present to his will violently, if necessary. Our task now is twofold. First, to prove his guilt beyond the shadow of a doubt. Second, to bring Colonel Fawcett to account for his crimes. He has constructed an elaborate lie. We, in turn, must construct the means to expose it, declared Sherlock Holmes. He rose and paced before the fireplace, his tall figure casting a long, restless shadow that danced with the flickering firelight. The restless energy had returned to him. The game was far from over. Indeed, the most dangerous phase was about to begin. I sensed that my friend was already formulating the next move in this deadly contest of wits. The fog had retreated somewhat, leaving the gas lamps on Baker Street to cast a clearer, though still mellow, glow upon the evening. Within our familiar rooms, a coal shifted in the grate with a soft sigh, the only sound for a moment, save for the distant, rhythmic clatter of a hansom cab over the cobblestones. Mycroft Holmes, a formidable presence even in repose, occupied the armchair opposite his brother, his gaze fixed upon Sherlock as he concluded his summary of the previous day's deductions. His voice, sharp and decisive, cut through the quiet. And so, the Jawi manuscript, far from being an ancient cry for vengeance, reveals itself as a most modern and malicious artifice, replied Sherlock Holmes. He paused, his gaze sweeping towards me, ensuring I grasped the enormity of the deception. The fire crackled softly, a counterpoint to the gravity of his words. Its purpose, Watson, he continued, his tone hardening, was to paint poor Sutton as a brute, thereby manufacturing a motive of native retribution to obscure the true killer, Colonel Reginald Fawcett. Mycroft Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers steepled. The very air about him seemed to carry the weight of governmental deliberation. His tones were measured, almost ponderous. A plausible theory, Sherlock. Fawcett has long advocated for a more robust approach in the Straits, remarked Mycroft Holmes. Mycroft adjusted his spectacles, a slight frown creasing his brow as he considered the implications. A carriage rumbled past outside, its wheels momentarily louder in a lull in their conversation. Sutton, for all his flaws, Mycroft resumed, represented a more moderate, if occasionally misguided, influence. Removing him and discrediting his methods would certainly serve Fawcett's ambitions, said Mycroft Holmes. Precisely, Mycroft. Fawcett underestimated Sutton. I suspect our unfortunate victim had begun to uncover either the Colonel's corrupt dealings or the brutal nature of his proposed policies. Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes tapped his fingers together, a familiar sign of his mind racing towards a solution. The scent of his strong tobacco hung faintly in the air. The manuscript, a desperate attempt at misdirection. And now, brother mine, we shall use that very desperation to ensnare the Colonel, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes sprang to his feet, his restless energy palpable as he strode across the room. The floorboards protested softly beneath him, the sound emphasizing the stark contrast with his brother's statue-like repose. We require a stage, Watson, and an irresistible lure. I propose the Malayan embassy. The Malayan embassy, I queried, somewhat taken aback. Is that wise, Holmes, considering the sensitivities? Dr. John Watson said. He paused, a glint in his eye. It is ideal. It provides a neutral yet highly relevant setting, replied Sherlock Holmes. He gestured expansively, as if already picturing the scene. From the street below, a newsboy's cry, faint and indistinct, drifted up. More importantly, Holmes elaborated, it allows for the presence of Raja Iskandar. He is, I am assured, most keen to see the truth of colonial machinations brought to light, especially those that tarnish his homeland's name or exploit its people. He will be our willing collaborator in this, not our quarry, replied Sherlock Holmes. Mycroft gave a slight inclination of his head, a silent signal of approval or perhaps confirmation of the Rajah's stance. Raja Iskandar is indeed cooperative. The Diogenes Club has certain channels. His assistance can be relied upon. What is your proposed bait, Sherlock? Answered Mycroft Holmes. His voice dropped slightly, taking on a conspiratorial edge. An urgent summons, ostensibly from the Rajah himself, or perhaps concerning a critical new discovery related to the manuscript, Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes leaned forward, the gaslight catching the sharp planes of his face. The only sound in the room was the soft hiss of the gas mantle. It must suggest that information has surfaced which directly threatens Colonel Fawcett's operations in Malaya, his reputation, perhaps even his liberty, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in. I could almost see the gears of the trap clicking into place in his mind. Something so alarming, he concluded, his voice a low thrum, that he would feel compelled to attend immediately, to control the narrative, to suppress the damage, explained Sherlock Holmes. He picked up a telegraph form from his desk, the paper crinkling in his hand. The message will hint at irrefutable proof of his duplicity, perhaps even linking him directly to the manuscript's fabrication, or worse, stated Sherlock Holmes. Holmes tapped the telegraph form he now held, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the dark wood of his desk. A clock ticked steadily on the mantelpiece. Fawcett is a man of considerable ego and ruthless ambition. The thought of public exposure, particularly initiated from a Malayan source, would be intolerable to him. He will walk into our parlor, observed Sherlock Holmes. A rare, thin smile touched Mycroft's lips. Ingenious, brother. And the government would be appreciative of a quiet resolution that exposes individual corruption rather than systemic failure. I shall ensure the necessary arrangements at the embassy are made discreetly, replied Mycroft Holmes. With the plan thus settled, a new tension filled the air, the quiet anticipation of the hunt. Holmes stood by the window, looking out into the gaslit street, the faint sounds of London's restless, hot a backdrop to the intricate trap now set. The game, as he was so fond of saying, was afoot, and Colonel Fawcett was its unsuspecting quarry. The Malayan embassy, a grand edifice in a quiet London square, possessed an air of exotic solemnity that I confess I found both impressive and somewhat unnerving. We were ushered into an appointed chamber where the scent of sandalwood, a fragrance I associated with distant, sun-baked lands, mingled faintly with the more familiar aroma of beeswax polish. Heavy damask curtains muted the city's clamor, lending a hushed expectancy to the room. Raja Iskandar, a figure of immense dignity in his traditional attire, sat composed, his dark eyes watchful, betraying nothing of his thoughts. Beside him, Holmes's brother Mycroft, ever the embodiment of discreet governmental power, observed the proceedings with that impassive countenance I had come to know so well, a mask that rarely slipped. Holmes himself stood near the ornate fireplace, his tall, spare figure silhouetted against the low light. I recognized at once the familiar tension in his posture, that quiet hum of intellectual energy that always signaled an impending denouement. The only sound for a moment was the soft tick of a grandfather clock in the hall beyond, its rhythmic pulse seeming to measure out the seconds before the inevitable confrontation. We had not long to wait. Presently, my ears, sharpened by many such vigils with Holmes, caught the firm, rather heavy tread of footsteps approaching along the polished corridor. The door opened, and a liveried attendant announced Colonel Reginald Fawcett. He entered with a show of brisk confidence, yet I fancied I detected a flicker of unease in his eyes as they swept over our assembled company. He offered a curt nod to Mycroft and Raja Iskandar, his gaze lingering for a moment longer, and with a touch more apprehension, I thought, upon my friend. An urgent summons, I was told. I trust this is of genuine import, gentlemen, said Colonel Reginald Fawcett. Of the gravest import, Colonel Fawcett. It concerns the late Sir Arthur Cunningham and a certain manuscript found in his possession. Sherlock Holmes said. I kept my gaze fixed upon Fawcett. His initial display of composure seemed to stiffen perceptibly at Holmes's words, and I noted his florid complexion deepen a shade. He made a dismissive gesture with his hand, but it lacked any real conviction. A tragic affair, of course, but I fail to see how it involves me to such an extent as to warrant this assembly. Colonel Reginald Fawcett answered. Let us begin with a small token, Colonel. This signet ring. It was found not upon Sir Arthur's person, nor amongst his effects, but rather pressed into the soft earth beneath his window, as if dislodged in a hurried departure. Its device, I believe, is familiar to you, observed Sherlock Holmes. As Holmes produced the ring, I observed Fawcett's reaction keenly. The colonel's face, once flushed with assumed indignation, now drained of all color. His eyes, fixed upon the glinting crest, widened in unmistakable recognition and fear. I may have lost such a ring some time ago. It signifies nothing, responded Colonel Reginald Fawcett. Perhaps, But let us turn to the manuscript itself. A fascinating document purporting to be a historical account from Malaya, one that would undoubtedly inflame passions and discredit certain British interests. However, upon closer examination, it reveals itself not as a relic, but as a rather clever, yet ultimately flawed fabrication. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes then gestured to a nearby table where the controversial manuscript lay. I saw Raja Iskandar lean forward, his expression intent, his dark eyes fixed upon the document that had caused so much turmoil. A fabrication, Mr. Holmes. You are certain of this, said Raja Iskandar. The paper and ink, Colonel, betray modern origins despite their aged appearance. But it is the Jawi script that condemns you. The pressure, flow, and subtle quirks of the characters match your official dispatches precisely. A forger may imitate style, Colonel, but the hand's ingrained habits are far harder to disguise. This instrument of misdirection was penned by you, observed Sherlock Holmes. So this document, which threatened to spill more of my people's blood, was a mere fabrication. A deception from the start, Raja Iskandar answered. At Raja Iskandar's pointed words, following so swiftly upon Holmes's irrefutable exposure, I watched as the color drained completely from Fawcett's face, leaving it a sickly, mottled gray. He opened his mouth, as if to protest, but no sound emerged. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the distant rumble of a carriage passing on the street outside. A mundane sound from a world far removed from the intense drama unfolding within those embassy walls. Sir Arthur Cunningham, I surmise, discovered your deception, Colonel. He realized the true nature of this manuscript, not an ancient call to arms, but a tool you intended to use, perhaps to discredit rivals, or even to incite unrest that you could then heroically quell, thereby enhancing your own reputation for stern governance in the eyes of Whitehall. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. A dangerous game, Colonel, playing with the stability of the Straits Settlements for personal advancement, said Mycroft Holmes. Sir Arthur threatened to expose you, did he not? And so you silenced him. You then planted this forgery, this carefully constructed lie, hoping it would be seen as the motive for an act of Malayan vengeance, thus diverting all suspicion from yourself, explained Sherlock Holmes. The fight seemed to drain from Fawcett entirely. He slumped into the nearest chair, his once robust frame suddenly appearing deflated, all bluster gone. His eyes, wide with a hunted look I had seen in many a cornered man, darted from Holmes to Mycroft, then to Raja Iskandar, finding no solace, no flicker of support in any quarter. Indeed, Colonel, a most ill-advised venture. The potential ramifications for His Majesty's government, had your scheme succeeded or even been clumsily revealed, are considerable, replied Mycroft Holmes. He would have ruined everything. Years of work, my position, remarked Colonel Reginald Fawcett, though not a full confession in the strictly legal sense. His broken demeanor and shattered words painted a picture of guilt more vivid than any formal admission could have achieved. I saw Mycroft Holmes exchange a brief, significant glance with Roger Iskandar, a silent acknowledgment that the truth, however ugly, was now laid bare between them. The trap, so meticulously set by my friend, had been sprung. The conspirator stood unmasked. A heavy silence descended once more upon the chamber, pregnant with the grim proceedings that I knew, with a sinking heart, must inevitably follow. The gaslight flickered, casting long shadows across our familiar sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street. Outside, the late autumn wind moaned around the eaves, echoing the somber thoughts that filled my mind. The whirlwind of the Malayan manuscript case had finally subsided, leaving behind a disquieting calm. Colonel Fawcett was, I presumed, contemplating his ruin within the confines of a police cell, his elaborate web of deceit torn asunder. Holmes, who had been staring into the heart of the crackling fire, his chin resting upon his hand, finally stirred. The only sounds for some time had been the hiss and pop of the coals and the distant, muffled rumble of a late-night cab passing along Baker Street. A sordid business, Watson, from start to finish. The reach of empire, it would seem, casts as much shadow as it does light, explained Sherlock Holmes. I nodded, watching the play of firelight on his keen, aquiline features. Indeed, Holmes. The lengths to which Fawcett went to fabricate not only a motive for another, but an entire historical narrative to support it. That forged Jawi manuscript was a masterpiece of villainy, asked Dr. John Watson. A dangerous masterpiece, he corrected, his eyes glinting. Its genius lay in its plausibility, Watson. Fawcett knew the most effective lies are woven with threads of truth. He exploited existing tensions, the very real difficulties of our rule in the Straits. The authentic manuscript, of course, painted a picture far less flattering to men of his ambition, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He rose then and began to pace, a familiar habit when his mind was deeply engaged. The floorboards creaked softly beneath his tread. Think of the twisted morality, Watson. A cruel administrator meets a cruel fate. His successor, hungry for power, then tries to twist the story to secure his own position and silence dissent. It's a small example of the larger, often tragic, story of empire itself. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. And what of Roger Iskandar and Miss Hayes? I asked, my thoughts turning to those caught in the cross-currents. Will this affair bring any true change to British-Malayan relations, or merely sow deeper mistrust? Dr. John Watson added. Holmes paused by the window, peering out into the swirling London fog that pressed against the panes. Change, Watson, is a slow and ponderous beast, particularly where empires are concerned. Roger Iskandar, I suspect, will continue to navigate the treacherous waters with his customary subtlety. Miss Hayes, with her commendable idealism, may find her studies forever marked by the grim realities she has witnessed. Perhaps her work, in time, will offer a truer account than any official report. Sherlock Holmes said. He turned back to the room, a wry expression on his face. The Diogenes Club will be relieved, of course. The immediate danger of the manuscript stirring up trouble is gone. But the underlying problems, Watson, remain. Fawcett's corruption is just one symptom of a deeper malady. This urge to control, to distort events and history for personal gain, it's a common human failing, given far greater power on the vast stage of empire. Sherlock Holmes responded. I considered his words. The case had been more than a mere puzzle of clues and deductions. It had been a journey into the shadowed corners of imperial power and the human heart. The echoes of this adventure, I felt, would resonate for a long time to come, not only in the distant Straits Settlements, but here, in the very heart of the empire. A sobering thought, Holmes, I said quietly, the weariness of the past weeks settling upon me. One hopes that lessons are learned, though history often suggests otherwise. Dr. John Watson said. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped Holmes. Indeed, Watson, but for tonight, at least, one villain has met his due, and perhaps that is a small measure of order restored to a disordered world. Sherlock Holmes said. He picked up his violin then, and soon the melancholy strains of some intricate lament filled our Baker Street rooms, a final, thoughtful coda to the adventure of the Malayan manuscript.